Well, it's time now for a look at what's making headlines in the international press, and for that I'm joined in the studio by Laurent Berstecker. Hi, Laurent.
Hi, Axel.
Now, we're starting in France, where the growing rate of COVID-19 infections is sparking a lot of concern in the press.
Much concern indeed, starting with Aujourd'hui en France, a French daily, which reports from an intensive care unit where there are now as many COVID patients as there were in late March, just before the curve exploded. Now, the newspaper says the second wave is already here, following the use of the term by Prime Minister Jean Castex on Monday, and is causing much concern in hospitals where doctors fear services could be saturated within 15 days if things continue as they are. They warn they won't be able to cope if the curve does not flatten soon. And now, despite the grim situation, the newspaper does argue that a better understanding of the virus has so far helped keep mortality rates down compared to the first wave.
Now, French President Emmanuel Macron is going to be addressing the nation on Wednesday. He's expected to be speaking about new measures coming into force in the face of this spike in infections. What are the French papers saying about that speech?
Well, all eyes are now on the president ahead of this speech, where many expect him to announce new measures to fight the virus. Daily newspaper La Dépêche du Midi asks whether these could mean imposing some forms of local lockdowns. It's something the prime minister said on Monday remained on the table, even though he argued against the return to a full nationwide lockdown, something, of course, they want to avoid.
Now, the UK has just announced the implementation of a series of new local lockdown measures. Take us through some of the action we're seeing in the British press today.
Well, let's start with the Daily Express, which quotes the Prime Minister Boris Johnson saying it would be unforgivable not to act now, and warning a full national lockdown could follow if people don't follow these new sets of rules. Now, these basically divide the UK into three zones, depending on their risk level, and these rules impose a series of measures such as pub closures or banning household mixing in these different zones. Now, according to The Guardian, tempers flared over these new rules, especially among northern mayors and Tory MPs who say they've not been consulted and that they've not received enough financial support to accompany these new measures. There's also been criticism by medical professionals of the measures who say they don't go far enough and that they won't be sufficient to contain the epidemic. And finally, we can see this critical approach in the Daily Mirror. With this headline, it all ends in tears, a slight play on word on the three-tiered lockdown, with the tabloid accusing the government of lacking a proper plan, despite 8 months of sacrifices and millions of jobs being on the line.
And of course, it's not just France and the United Kingdom. A lot of European countries are trying to implement measures to ward off this dreaded resurgence in cases.
That's right. Well, let's start by looking at Belgium, where newspaper Le Soir is headlining on the possibility of a second lockdown and the potential scenarios that could entail. It's becoming increasingly likely, according to the article, as the sanitary situation has gone from worrying to alarming in just a matter of days. And a curfew has already been imposed in 2 of the country's regions. Now, the author explores several possible ways these lockdown measures could be applied without completely shutting down the country, for instance, dividing them by age group or by region.
Now, in Germany, regions have already been divided up in accordance with their risk levels. Federal states each have their own set of restrictions.
Well, that's right. And according to Deutsche Welle, the situation might be getting a little too confusing for some Germans, especially the so-called accommodation ban, which prevents them from traveling between states. If they travel between states, it prevents them from staying in hotels only if they come from a COVID hotspot, what's considered a COVID hotspot, which makes the measures very difficult to enforce and to track. And has led to calls by MPs and economists in Germany to adopt a more streamlined approach to the virus and to the fight against the virus, something which will be discussed on Wednesday during an extraordinary meeting.
Okay, well, moving on to a slightly different story. A new study looks at whether people who stay in long-term relationships end up looking like each other. Tell us more.
Well, it's apparently a question that has intrigued and fascinated psychologists for decades, and we may now have the beginning of an answer, according to The Guardian. Now, the original study was performed in 1987 and found that people grew more alike the longer their marriage went on. Now, researchers at Stanford University took this study and repeated it on a larger scale with some 500 couples in their database, and they found no evidence that the faces actually grew more similar as time passed. Their hypothesis, however, is that people tend to look alike at the start of the relationship, meaning that we may unconsciously seek out partners who look like us, just as we tend to look for people with similar personality traits. Maybe a little bit of narcissism at play here.
Turns out we're all narcissists. Who'd have thought it? Laurent Berstecker with a look through the international papers. Thank you very much.